Hi everyone, thank you all for joining today's webinar, How to Ace Your SaaS-Based EDC System Validation for Sponsors and CROs, presented by SDC and QACV Consulting. We appreciate you taking the time to listen in and watch our presentation today. My name is Melanie Ciotti. I'm a Business Development Associate here at SDC, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I have some basic housekeeping notes to share with you before we get started on introducing today's speakers. First, we are recording today's webinar, and we get this question a lot. We will be sending out the recording to everyone who registered for today's event, as well as the slide deck. So you should be receiving a link via email within the next 24 hours following the event. Additionally, you have the ability to listen in via your computer speakers, or you can call in with the telephone information provided in the GoToWebinar panel. We'll be answering questions in a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please submit your questions in the chat box throughout the presentation as your questions arise. We will review them all at the end. If we don't have a chance to get to all of the questions, we will try to respond to them via email and follow up to the webinar as time permits. Finally, we'll be polling the audience during the webinar, so if you are at your computer, we greatly appreciate your participation. It's a pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Chris Wobolt, Principal at QACV Consulting, is an expert consultant for quality assurance, compliance, and computer system validation in the FDA-regulated life sciences industries. With over 25 years of experience, Chris specializes in data integrity, computer system validation and compliance, GCP audits and training, and quality system development. Chris was a contributing member of the ISPE GIMP Laboratory Systems Special Interest Group, which published the Good Practice Guide, Validation of Laboratory Computerized Systems. Chris was also a chapter chair and editorial board member for DIA's recent publication, Computerized Systems in Clinical Research, Current Data Quality and Data Integrity Concepts. Quan Doan, Associate Director, EDC Solutions at SDC, has over 15 years of clinical data management and clinical programming expertise. He currently manages our EDC Solutions and Clinical Programming Department here at SDC. Quan specializes in clinical data management system selection, implementation, and software validation, and he also has experience in software quality assurance. He has validated both internally hosted and SaaS-based EDC systems for SDC and for other companies as well, including validation of Oracle Clinical RDC, OpenClinica, and iMedNet eClinical. For today's webinar, Chris will share his expertise in discussing what auditors want to see in your validation documentation. Then he's going to dive into intended use validation for sponsors and CROs using SaaS-based EDC systems. Quan will then share his best practices for implementing an EDC validation using SDC's intended use validation of iMedNet eClinical as a case study example and pulling from previous history as well. After reviewing some key takeaways, we should have about 15 minutes left to answer Q&A at the end of the presentation. So like I mentioned before, go ahead and submit your questions as they arise in the chat box. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Chris.
Thank you, Melanie, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide this presentation to the audience and to participate with SDC on describing best practices for software as a service validation. And what I'd like to do, I perform a lot of audits for different organizations, and I'd like to go through and describe some of the things to look for when an audit of a software as a service provider is conducted. And we'll go through some of the aspects of data integrity. That's a hot FDA and regulatory agency focus at this point. And there's clear expectations that systems not only are required to be tested, but we have to understand and ensure that they're used appropriately for clinical studies based upon the study protocol requirements and to meet GCP requirements. Just a quick overview of data integrity, and again, that's the key of any validated system, is ensuring that the data that's collected and maintained is complete, that it's consistent, and that it's accuracy, because that data is then used to support regulatory submissions. And all data, including data that is generated and maintained with a SaaS application, software as a service application, is required to meet ALCOA principles. The core elements for ALCOA include attributable. All records and data must be attributable to the person who entered or completed that data. It must be legible. And that's easy and straightforward with paper, but legibility also includes the electronic records and ensuring that the appropriate formats and structure of the data is readable and viewable electronically as well for software as storage applications. Contemporaneous, so data needs to be entered and the audit trail needs to be for the date and time that the activities were completed and identified who actually completed that data. Data should be original or true copies of original records. For electronic records, the original records are actually, it may be more difficult to have a true copy of an electronic record, so some considerations regarding validation need to be incorporated when you make backups and true copies of the original record as well. And all data must be accurate, and a lot of times that is included in the edit checks and the data cleaning processes. And then for electronic records, there's the concept of Alcoa Plus. All records must be enduring. You need to have the records available electronically throughout the record retention time period as required by GCPs. The records must be complete, which includes all metadata and any other attributes associated with the electronic data, including audit trails. The data must be consistent, and it must be available for review during audits or inspections or review of records for regulatory submissions. So what is computer validation and why validate? So computer validation is documented evidence which provides a high degree of assurance that a system consistently performs according to its predetermined specifications and quality attributes. And validation specifically is required by 21 CFR Part 11, 10A, which states that for closed systems, really all electronic record-keeping systems, validation is required to ensure the accuracy, reliability, consistent intended performance, and the ability to discern invalid or altered records. So if you look at what we had talked about with data integrity, the ability to discern invalid or altered records is really a data integrity principle. So we validate to ensure data integrity. So what is validation? And some of you may be IT or QA professionals, others may be clinical professionals. So I'm going to go through basically what is validation from a user perspective. And validation is really just the process. If you have a manual process, that the manual process is automated. So if you identify what the key steps are for the manual process, for example, for an EDC system, you have study setup, you verify edit checks are accurate and complete, you enter data, there's data reconciliations and database lock. There are other elements also, but validation is really automating that process. And the key deliverables when you automate a manual process for a validated system are the user requirement specification, where you identify the intended use. That information then is used to develop specifications for the system, what the system actually will do to meet the user requirements, and then validation testing. And sometimes for users, it's primarily user acceptance testing, but we're really just verifying that the system has been set up and configured properly according to the specifications, and that's an independent process from the setup and configuration process. So we're verifying that the user requirements have been met. And I wanted to include a section here on, this is software as a service, so it's for EDC systems, that's common. And some of you may be familiar with internal systems, like maybe the old Oracle Clinical Data Management System, which was installed internally at many companies, and all the validation activities were completed by the user, by the sponsor, and the software was provided by the vendor, and the vendor had an SDLC, software development lifecycle process, where they developed quality software according to their procedures and processes, and then that software then is sold or provided to the sponsor, and they installed the software on their servers and workstations. The deliverables for validation, typical deliverables, and again, your own SOPs need to be followed, but typical deliverables for an internal validation would include the validation plan, requirements, functional specifications, configuration specifications. The sponsor would then install the software on the servers. They would do system testing. Sometimes that may be called operational qualification testing. And user acceptance testing. There would be a traceability matrix that would link the specifications to the test documentation. A validation summary report would be generated to summarize the validation activities. And then there would be SOPs on using the system and maintaining the system in a validated state and ensuring the integrity of the records that are collected on that system. So that's normally for an internal vendor or internally hosted validation, the expectations. And then if you have a software as a service vendor, there are some differences in how the validation is conducted. So for a software as a service application, the server is maintained and the software is installed and maintained by the vendor, and they also take on the responsibilities for some of the validation activities. The user or the sponsor is still responsible for a validation plan. They're still responsible for determining the user requirements or the intended use of the system, and they are responsible for conducting user acceptance testing and have a traceability matrix and validation summary report and some SOPs as well for the use of the system. However, the vendor takes on some of the responsibilities for validation, including, in addition to their SDLC deliverables, the deliverables that are generated as part of their software development lifecycle process, they also generate functional specifications, configuration specifications. Since the software and hardware is maintained and managed by the vendor, they also are responsible for installation qualification and also doing the core validation of their product. And they would have a traceability matrix and their own SOPs as well to ensure that the system is used as intended. They also need to have release management practices, and then for any vendor and sponsor, a quality agreement which defines roles and responsibilities, which SOPs will be followed, how change control is managed, and things like that would also be required. So those are the key differences between an internal validation and a software as a service validation. All systems are still required to be validated. The sponsor or the user is responsible for validation, but on a software as a service platform, the vendor assists in the validation process and supports the validation process for the sponsor. Okay, and again, the focus is on the intended use of the system as opposed to just testing the system. It's how the system is set up to support a clinical study based on the protocol requirements. The perception that many people have is that validation is vendor-driven. The validation is supported by the vendor in software as a service applications, but the user or the sponsor is still the primary, they're responsible for the validation of the system. They can rely on the vendor to support that as well, but the user is responsible for the validation of the system. If an EDC system isn't validated, the EDC vendor will not get a 43, it will be the sponsor. Business processes, many times for vendor-driven validation, are not validated. So again, the intended use is the business process or the process that's set up to support the clinical study based on the protocol requirements. And the focus for vendors is typically on functional testing, and it really needs to be on how the system is set up to support a clinical study. FDA, they published a guidance document recently on data integrity. The guidance is specific to GMPs, but the FDA data is data, so many of the concepts within the FDA guidance can be applied to GCP as well. And the FDA states that if you validate a computerized system, but you don't validate it for its intended use, you cannot know if the workflow in this case or the study has been set up correctly. So a study or workflow is an intended use of a computerized system that's checked through validation. So that's an important concept to consider, as opposed to relying on what the vendor does primarily for testing the functionality of the system. The MHRA also has a guidance document. The original guidance document was published in March of 2015. It again was for GMP as well, but in July of 2016, the MHRA published a draft guidance of the same guidance document, but it applies to GXPs. So they are expecting the same type of controls for data integrity for GCP data as they would be for GMP data, and their draft guidance reflects that. I think FDA will follow in that approach as well, because again, data is data. You need to have controls for data, but right now the FDA guidance is only for GMP. And the MHRA guidance states that you're required to have an understanding of the computerized systems functions within a process. Again, the process to ensure data integrity for a clinical study. For this reason, just relying on vendor documentation and isolation of the study protocol requirements or the system configuration of how edit checks are set up and things like that, or user profiles are set up, is not considered to be acceptable. And they state specifically in isolation of the intended process or the user's system, the user study that's been set up within the system, vendor testing is likely to be limited only to functional verification only and may not fulfill the requirements for performance qualification or user acceptance testing. And again, the user is the sponsor, the vendor is not the user. So user acceptance testing is called UAT because it's expected to be done by a user representative.
So Chris, before we go on to Quan, you had some polls that you wanted to ask the audience, so I'm going to pull up the first one right now, if you guys can see it. So if you can go ahead and answer the true-false question, if you're at your computer. All right, looks like we have about 3/4 of people who have answered so far, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in just a few seconds. All right, so it looks like so the true-false question is 21 CFR Part 11 provides specific guidance on how to validate computerized systems. Looks like we have 23% say true, 65% say false, and 12% say I don't know. Chris, do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. Part 11 requires the computerized systems be validated based upon 21 CFR Part 1110A, but it really only states that validation of computerized systems is required. It doesn't say how validation is required or what the requirements are for validation, but it only states that computerized systems are required to be validated that are used for GXP or GCP purposes. There's other FDA guidance that discusses in more detail what the typical aspects of validation are, and we went through those in the earlier presentation. The user requirements, the validation plan, and the testing protocol, test plans, and the system specifications, the validation summary reports, and so forth. Those are all elements of validation, and Part 11, again, only requires, has a statement that validation is required for GCP systems.
Perfect, thank you. Now we have another one I'm going to share right now. Let's launch the poll. Commercial off-the-shelf systems do not need user requirement specifications. True, false, or I don't know. All right, looks like we have most people, most attendees have answered at this point. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll just a few more seconds and share that with everybody. All right, looks like most people said false. So commercial off-the-shelf systems do not need user requirement specifications. Consensus seems to be false. Chris, would you like to elaborate?
No, everyone's correct, because all computerized systems that are used for GCP purposes need to be validated, and you really can't validate a system without having user requirements, because that, again, is the intended use of the system. And otherwise, you just have functionality that can be tested, but it may or may not be used as part of the intended use of the system to support a clinical study. And now Quan will take over the next part of the presentation.
Thank you, Melanie and Chris. So now we'll be going over the best practices on actually implementing your intended use validation for your EDC platforms. We'll take a look at what SDC did for our iMedNet eClinical platform, which is a SaaS-based platform. So looking at the 4 phases of validation, again, Chris mentioned this earlier in his presentation. System validation, whether it's for intended use or not, is relatively the same. You have very similar phases for those for this validation process, and so we'll be doing a deeper dive into each of these phases throughout the presentation. So in general, we have your planning phase, your requirements analysis, the actual UAT itself, and then releasing and maintaining your validated state thereafter. So for validation planning, thinking about intended use validation, the world of EDC platforms is constantly evolving, and we've seen an increase in the trend of all-in-one platforms. So if you look at the metadata raves, the merge eClinicals, iMedNet, you notice that there are a lot of add-on modules that are part of your platform. You may have an ePro functionality, CTMS, or CEC functionality built in, but as a CRO or a sponsor, if you are not using that module, there is no need to do that validation because you're, again, for intended use, you're not using it. So the key piece in validation planning is to determine the scope of the validation, have all of your key stakeholders in the room and determine what you will be using, how you will be using it, and if it can be validated. Again, the key stakeholders involved in this validation process are your process owners. So for an EDC system, it would be your data management team, making sure that they understand how the system is going to support their processes. They are also the end users, so keeping in mind site users, monitors, what their functionality needs to be from the end game standpoint, and make sure that those components are validated. And then obviously you do need quality assurance involvement in this step for a number of reasons. One, to make sure that you are meeting all of your regulatory requirements in terms of validation, as Chris mentioned earlier, and also to review the components that we as the end users can't validate and lean on the vendors and go do the vendor qualification audits to cover how the vendor is going to do their implementation or releases for each version of the system. And again, remember that if we look at the internally hosted systems where you have ownership over the hardware, that's something that you can test. You would normally do a hardware qualification, make sure that the servers are up to spec and can handle the volume and load that you're going to be using, whereas you don't have that in a software as a service-based platform. And so it's going to be key for your QA team to go out and review the vendor's processes to make sure at least their equipment is up to par with what you feel the system needs, and to make sure that when they do their software development, they are within regulatory compliance because we are in this regulated industry. The next phase is requirements analysis. We do have several layers of requirements, and Chris kind of touched on this earlier. For the actual intended use validation, the key focus here is on user and system requirements. At this point, you should have already covered your business requirements prior to selecting the EDC system. So if you think about something that would be a business requirement, it would be something like, the system needs to be user-friendly. It has to have a nice-looking interface. Shouldn't cost more than X amount a month because we can't cascade that down to our clients. Or must contain high-level modules such as IWR or CEC. So those are your business level requirements. Those are more difficult to test, and so when you're developing your user requirements and your system requirements, you need to make sure that they are clear, verifiable, and concise. These requirements, when you define them, really should state what the system should do, not necessarily how the system will do it. Because a lot of times there are many ways within a system that you can achieve the same end goal, and so you want to make sure that you keep your requirements at a level where you don't get too detailed and it becomes confusing for an auditor to review. The other key component here is to make sure that your regulatory requirements are included. So as Chris mentioned earlier, looking at 21 CFR Part 11, there's a requirement for audit trails and the components of what that audit trail needs. So make sure that those are clearly laid out in your requirements analysis. Aside from Part 11, if you are planning on using your system outside of the U.S. and the EU, for example, you'll also want to make sure that your Annex 11 requirements are also met. They are similar to the Part 11 requirements, but as you read through the guidances, you'll notice that Europe does go a little bit more detailed in terms of their requirements, and so you want to make sure that that's covered if you're planning on going global and using your EDC platform. On the next slide, we'll go over a couple examples of good and bad requirements, so we'll take a look at that. So looking up here on the screen, so the first requirement here that's written has the system shall prevent users from accessing the system upon multiple failed login attempts. Now, from a testing standpoint, or from a reviewer standpoint, what does multiple mean? Each person looking at this requirement can take this as, well, I'm going to be more conservative. I'm going to say multiple means at least 5 failed login attempts. And another auditor may come and say, well, technically 2 is multiple. That's more than 1. And so to help appease that when your auditors are looking at your documentation, especially around your user requirements, make sure that you can be a little bit more detailed and specify, what we really mean is the system shall prevent users from accessing the system upon 3 failed login attempts. You can have a discrete and objective evidence to prove that, and there's no question in that when someone's looking at your documentation. Another example here, again, this is more subjective. So the system shall save a CRF quickly. How do you define quickly? Site users, a lot of times, are very busy people, and they may say, you know what, after 10 seconds, if it's not done, I don't like it. So as a business process owner, we should come up with requirements to clearly delineate what our threshold is for a CRF save time. So we want to make sure in this case, for example, the system shall save a CRF within 2 minutes. It's a reasonable time point, looking at, especially with all of the edit checks and all of the new functionality within systems, that's typically a good time frame, especially for any CRFs that contain a lot of data points. And the last one here is, again, the bad example here is the system shall provide an audit trail. What does that mean? If you're looking at a software development company, that can mean something very different than what we have here in the regulated industry. And so as per Part 11, the system shall provide an audit trail with timestamps, so that's attributable to whoever entered the data, when they did it, when they did an update to a data point, when they inserted a new data point, or when they deleted a data point. So you want to make sure that your requirements cover all aspects of that. The next phase really is where the bulk of the work comes into play. It is definitely the most resource-intensive phase, as we experience here at STC. Here you need to develop your test cases for each of the requirements as defined in phase 2. You'll definitely want someone that is a system expert, because they understand the system well and understand the best ways to create those test cases. You want to make sure that you can do positive and negative testing wherever possible. For example, if you had a user requirement that a user shall be locked out after 3 failed login attempts, the natural progression of things, you would write the test case to log in 3 times incorrectly and fail that case. But again, you also want to validate that you can log in after failing only once or only failing twice. So there is where your positive and negative testing come into play. Test cases should also be written in a manner such that someone who's never used a system would be able to execute that test case. Meaning you want detailed step-by-step instructions with an explicit result. Again, this goes back to the notion of Alcoa, something that you can do consistently, repetitively, without failure. And so regardless of how strong the user is, you want to make sure that anyone can use the system in the appropriate manner. The other thing to note too is a lot of times as a strong system user, a lot of times you understand where the bugs are and you know where the workarounds are, and so a lot of times they may skip steps within the testing process, which again introduces doubt into your entire validation. You want to create a traceability matrix, as Chris mentioned earlier, to trace between your test cases and your requirements. This is going to help your inspector or auditor look at your documentation in an easy manner. A lot of times you're not going to have someone sit there and review, all 20 modules of your system, but they may key in on your Part 11 component, and they can easily jump to those test cases and review that documentation. Make sure that your testers are properly trained in GDP and the validation plan itself. Again, because Part 11 doesn't call out how you need to validate, that should be detailed out in your validation plan, and you want to make sure that you cover yourself and your testers to make sure that there are no gaps within your validation process. The other thing that's very key to this whole process is your objective evidence. So make sure that you can use output directly from the system as you're executing your test cases as your results. We've had, I've seen users who do their validation just write as expected in their results or hand write out the result that they see on the screen, but that still can be questionable in terms of how accurate it is. So anything that you can export out of the system for your validation, if it's exporting a report or generating a CRF casebook, those are things that will definitely aid in your validation, intended use validation. And then the last piece here in terms of UAT is, as we all know, there's no perfect system or perfect tester out there in the world. It is expected that you will encounter failures during your system validation, and that's perfectly normal. They may be due to tester error, if there's if a step was skipped, or if you happen to discover a system bug. These failures should all undergo root cause analysis, and a mitigation plan should be developed for each one of those. And the mitigation plans can go a number of different ways. A lot of times the objective is still met. You do have to put in a workaround, and so that workaround could be part of your SOPs. So that, again, this plays into intended use validation, and it's not just what the system can do, but how your business process utilizes the system to achieve the end result and perform your clinical studies. The other piece of this, again, if it is a system bug that can't be resolved via workaround, now is a great time to relay that information back to the vendor. Hopefully there's a strong relationship there, and they can evaluate that and correct that bug as quickly as possible. So the last phase of validation is your validation summary report. So once your testing is completed and all the failures are evaluated and mitigated, we're now ready to release the system for use. The validation summary report should include a fairly high-level summary of all of your testing and the results and any of those failures and mitigations. This document is typically where your inspector or auditor would go first during the review of your intended use validation. And so you want to make sure that you contain enough information there to satisfy them, and hopefully they won't dive deeper into the rest of your validation at this point. You'll want to coordinate your system release with all the SOPs that were written for your system at this point in time as well. Again, making sure that because this is your intended use validation, that your business processes are set, your validation is complete for your system, and any mitigation processes are also available at this time. A couple of other things to come in mind. So now that you've validated the system and you're ready to run with it, you have to think about future releases. This is kind of a key point with software as a service. Again, because we don't own the servers, we don't own the installation process as an end user of software as a service platforms. Vendors can more or less impose their will and release software at any given time. So you want to develop a process on how to handle that. How often you should be doing testing, when you should be doing testing. Is it only going to be, after hot fixes or only after new functionality is introduced? those are all things that we can work out internally within your company and plan for moving forward. Looking at this entire process, again, it is pretty resource intensive, and so you'll want to develop a regression test suite to test your high-risk items. It can be a subset of what you've already done up to this point, so pulling out the key components such as your Part 11 test cases and your basic data entry cases. That way, for every new release, you can always re-execute that standard regression suite. That'll definitely save on time and resources, and then you still make sure that your key bases for your operations are covered for each release. I'm going to go through a little flow chart on the next slide about what to do and if your software as a service vendor gives you different options during the release process for new releases. So the first question that comes to mind, obviously, does the vendor allow you to opt in or opt out of a new version? I've seen in the past with Omnicom TrialMaster, they could say, your study can stay on this version throughout the end of the study, and so you don't necessarily need to worry about upgrading and validating that new version. But for most of us, and most other platforms, you don't get the choice. They're going to do their quarterly releases every year, so there's your 4 releases, and you have to accept that upgrade. So what do you need to do? So if your vendor doesn't give you the ability to opt out, you do need to regather your validation team and take a look at, what does this feature release impact? Does it have new functionality that we need to test? Are they modifying something that was previously tested and therefore could affect the validated state of your environment? And how does that affect your clinical study down the road? And so if you know that you have to accept the upgrade, then you can push back on the vendor and ask them, do you provide us a sandbox prior to releasing that change into production? Well, we have, as the end user, have an opportunity to test those changes and that new functionality. And if they do give you that window, definitely try to be proactive and execute your validation within that time frame. I know that using Metadata Rave, they typically give you about a month's notice prior to a new major release, and they'll provide URL owners with a test environment to do their testing, provide feedback, and hopefully, if there are no major bugs, then the release will happen after that month time frame is up. iMetNet is the same way. We work closely with them. They give us about 3 weeks notice on a release, and we get about 2 weeks for testing and feedback. And so definitely take advantage of that if your vendor does allow for that. There are some vendors that don't have that capability, and so you'll want to think about the time frame post-release into production when you can revalidate or at least re-verify some of the functionality. Again, you'd want to do this as soon as possible after a new release, typically 2 weeks to a month after that release. It's going to depend on, obviously, the company's release cycles. So if they're releasing 2 releases a year, typically that month time frame is okay. You have time to catch bugs early on prior to the next release. If they do monthly releases, obviously you can't wait a month to test that, then you'll be cascading onto future releases. So you want to make sure that that's covered in your processes with the systems that you're using. And again, the key thing here is to make sure that you're not putting your system at risk. You are making sure that your system remains in a validated state, and that if you do catch any bugs, they are caught early on in those releases and have minimal impact on your studies moving forward. That concludes the intended use validation or case study of the SEC iMetNet EDC validation. So we're going to take you to the key takeaways to ace your audits. So again, intended use validation, as Chris mentioned, is user-driven. It does need to incorporate your business processes and your user requirements. The key thing here, again, as per the FDA and MHRA guidances, it is focused on risk to data integrity. So making sure that it is attributable, legible, repeatable, for your system. As for best practices for EDC implementation, again here, You can scope down this validation to only validate what you plan to use as part of your business processes or offerings, so you don't have to run the full gamut of validating all of these other components that you don't plan on using down the road. Again, make sure that the requirements that you've defined are verifiable and concise so that you can test them. And then the key takeaway here as well is to make sure that you do have a process in place for those new releases, because again, with software as a service, it's something that we as the end users have little or no control over, and so we want to make sure that we try to maintain our validated state.
Great, thank you so much, Quan. And just we do have some additional resources here for the audience logged in. And like I said before, this will be provided via email, both the recording and the slide deck. So these are live links you'll be able to click on if you need to reference the FDA guidances or any of the other documents that Chris and Quan had mentioned previously. And at this point, we're right on time for some Q&A. We have some great questions that came in online. I'm going to relay a few of them to Chris and Quan. We should get through maybe probably 5 or so at least. So the first question I have here, Chris, I believe this one is for you. It says the draft FDA guidance is applicable to GMPs, you said, and why do we follow it for GCP?
Okay, that's a good question. And it is a draft guidance. It is applicable to GMP currently. But again, data is data, and it's collected in many cases the same way. And as we saw with the MHRA guidance, which was originally for GMP, it was expanded to GXP. The FDA concepts within the guidance, the draft FDA guidance, can be applied to GCP principles as well, GCP data as well. So although it's not required, no guidance is required even for GMP. It's all FDA best practice, if you want to call it that. But if you can use the guidance to apply appropriate controls to ensure data integrity to GCP data as well.
Great, thank you. Quan, maybe this one would be good for you. We have somebody who says they have heard of some EDC companies that offer validation packages, and I guess they just want a little bit more information on that. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, thanks, Melanie. And that definitely is a good question. There are several companies out there that have kind of caught on to this wind of intended use validation, and they do offer kind of pre-packaged test suites. So they'll have SOPs, kind of templated SOPs available, test cases and user requirements documents, a lot of the documentation that you would need to perform your intended use validation. Now, one thing to be aware of is, again, those are very cookie cutter, very cut and dry, and very similar to what the vendor would do for their validation. So again, as Chris touched on this earlier, you still want to have your validation team take a look at that package and evaluate it to make sure that the components that you are testing are present and that you can expand on those if necessary. So if you know you're going to be, you want to evaluate their test cases to make sure that they are robust enough for your company standards, make sure that your requirements are met. And again, these SOPs, you want to make sure that they work within your own business practice. So they can use them as a starting point, but you'll definitely need to modify that to work with your company and with your clients. So again, it should reduce the number of resources that you may need upfront initially, but definitely tailor that to your company's needs.
Great, thank you. This is a great one. So it says, who has to perform the validation, the sponsor or the CRO? Chris, maybe you could answer, and then Quan, if you have anything to add to that.
So, and it depends on the delegation of responsibilities. So the sponsor, if they're managing the study and so forth, they would need to do the validation for the system, for the study. And if the CRO has been delegated those responsibilities, then the CRO would be expected to validate the system, create edit checks for the study-specific protocol requirements, and so forth. So it really depends on who is doing the work if the CRO is the user, when they are assessing EDC data and verifying that the data is clean and so forth, for example, then it would be the CRO. If the sponsor is doing it on their own, it could be the sponsor, or if there are shared responsibilities, it would be the sponsor and the CRO that could perform the validation.
Right, and thanks, Chris. And just wanted to add a little bit to that too. In a lot of cases, especially on the CRO side, we've actually had a lot of clients surprised when they come on site and audit SEC, because they see that we actually have intended use validation for our EDC platform. It is the new trend, but traditionally a lot of folks coming on site would only expect a qualification audit of your EDC vendor. And as Chris mentioned, with the way that the industry is moving, that's simply not enough at this point in time. So we want to be proactive as possible and try to do that intended use validation if you're offering up that EDC platform as a service offering.
Great, thanks. We have another question that says, what SOPs are needed for SaaS systems? Chris, could you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. If you go back to an internally hosted validation and system, so a system that is not a SaaS-based system, there are lots of SOPs that are required for security, for example, how to assign user roles to users within the system, or things like backup and restore of the data, disaster recovery, if there's a disaster at the end of the computing environment, so you can recover the system and the data and so forth. Change control is another example. So if there are changes, and Clint mentioned this during his part of the talk, vendors can update their versions after they notify their customers, and that's part of change control. So if it was an internally hosted application, that would be the change control for the sponsor or the CRO that would be generated or followed, that SOP. But for a software as a service application, it's really a joint process where the vendor, the software as a service vendor, has a change control SOP where they notify their clients. It may be part of their release management SOP, possibly. And then the sponsor or the CRO, it's a change to a system that they use for GXP, GCP purposes, so there would be an expectation that they would also have a change control to document the change to their environment. So those are some of the SOPs that you would expect for a software as a service application, the same SOPs that you would have for an internally hosted application, but some of the procedures are going to be managed by the vendor, and some will be managed by the sponsor or the CRO, and some will be shared responsibilities.
Thanks. We have somebody who just submitted a question that kind of piggybacks on one of the previous ones, but a little more direct. So if a sponsor outsources all activities to a vendor and DM group, can that data management group be tasked and responsible for the formal UAT testing, or does someone from the sponsor, the actual biotech or pharma company, need to perform the UAT? Quan, I think this would be good for you.
Sure. And so again, as Chris mentioned earlier too, because at this point the sponsor has delegated all authority around that EDC platform to that vendor and that DM group, the DM group would ultimately be responsible. Certainly, as the sponsor, you would still need to have oversight over that process. You don't necessarily need to do your own formal validation, but it would certainly behoove you to at least participate in it and definitely have oversight over that process.
So that would be similar to when our clients work with SDC, they outsource the full data management to us and they audit our intended use validation.
Correct.
And because it's our iMedNet system that we are developing internally.
Yes.
Perfect. Quan, here's a good question for you. How long should a validation take? So maybe explain how long it took for SEC to do our intended use validation of iMedNet and what you've seen in other systems as well.
Sure. So for SEC, for the iMedNet platform, it took us about 3 months to do. Again, a lot of the resources went into developing the test cases and the modules making sure that our business processes were up to par before implementing the system. The actual testing itself, in terms of execution, only took about a week and a half. Again, it's making sure that all of your ducks in a row, all of your documentation is in the right place. That takes the bulk of the time. Now, again, for future releases, you're not necessarily validating the entire system again, so you won't need that 3 to 6 month time frame. You'd be using your regression test suite, hopefully if you've developed one, and then only testing key new functionality that comes out. And so that should be reduced to, to under a month, which is why we gave that 1 month window earlier with respect to new releases and new functionality.
Chris, I believe this question refers back to some of your slides. It says, I've seen some SaaS systems when the user can configure the system, but the slides indicate that the vendor manages configuration. Could you share some clarification around that and if that changes anything with the validation?
Yes. In some cases, it depends on what the software actually allows. In some cases, the vendor can only configure, their administrators can only configure the system. In other cases, the vendor's software allows the CRO or sponsored users to configure the system. So in those situations, then the configuration spec would actually be on the sponsor or the CRO side of the validation deliverables. And again, that depends upon the system, the capabilities of the system. I've seen it, configuration being controlled and managed by both the vendor or the CRO or sponsor, and it just depends on the capabilities, and that really should be defined within the agreement that the sponsor or CRO has with the vendor regarding who is responsible for which deliverables or documentation for the validation package.
Yeah, and Chris, I'd like to add to that as well. So again, with the user configuration piece, I've seen it in use with, for example, metadata rave, where you have the software is configured initially, right, by the vendor, that they program the application and they have that configuration piece of it. But then when they release that client URL to each client or each sponsor or CRO that utilizes their platform, they have the ability to do their what they call is core configuration. So that core configuration is programmed for your URL only, and so as part of your intended use validation, you would validate that core configuration. So you want to make sure that if you have 10 roles set up in your core configuration, that those 10 roles are set up correctly, and the workflows associated with those roles are validated during your intended use validation. Because metadata, as the software provider, doesn't understand your workflow, and again, that's where the key differentiating piece is between intended use validation versus just regular system validation.
Great, thanks for that clarification, both to you, Chris and Kwan. We should have time for about one more question. I have one here. Kwan, could you explain a little bit more about what should be included in the regression suite? I believe that's referencing the high-risk items that you were talking about a few slides ago.
Yeah. So as part of your regression suite, obviously you want to cover key components that could definitely impact your business and your business processes. So obviously the key one that should jump out to everyone are your regulatory requirements. So with each release, making sure that you do retest your Part 11 requirements or Annex 11 requirements, that the audit trails are intact and that they're not affected, by any of the changes or in the code release. Other components typically that need to be tested during your suite would be your very, very basic data entry steps, making sure that users can still enter data and that data is still stored properly in your system. And then obviously, if you are using the IWR component for your randomized trials, make sure that you have, making sure that randomization still works. The subjects can still be randomized and your clinical trials can still continue. Other things like edit checks may be trivial. Those, again, it's not a true impact to data integrity necessarily or directly. And so those can always be resolved and tested at a later time. But as your core suite, you want to make sure that Part 11 is covered for sure.
Perfect. So we do have a couple questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, so I'll go ahead and share those with Chris and Kwan offline and see if we can send those individuals the answers directly. At this time, I'll leave the GoToWebinar panel open if we have any last-minute questions that you would like for us to address offline. Other than that, thank you all so much for joining, and you should be receiving the link to watch the recording within 24 hours. Thank you so much.